Welcome to Life Chapter, where the most unexpected stories unfold. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It only takes a second, but your support fuels us to bring you more captivating stories. And now, let's dive into a tale you won't soon forget. I never imagined my life would take such a turn. I grew up in a quiet little town, dreaming of a simple and joyful life. I married my college sweetheart Adam when we were young and hopeful. We didn't have much, but our love was enough, or so I believed. Looking back now, I can see the warning signs, but at the time, I was blissfully unaware. When Adam and I moved into a cozy little house, we met Mr. Thompson, our landlord. The house wasn't extravagant, but it had character. A charming little garden and a backyard I adored. It felt like a perfect start to our new chapter. Mr. Thompson was an older gentleman, probably in his early 60s, with a warm, ever-present smile. He was the kind of landlord who would check in every so often, making sure everything was in order. The first time he stopped by was to fix a broken fence. He was polite, thoughtful, and always made lighthearted conversation about how the neighborhood had evolved over the years. At the time, I thought nothing of it. He was just a friendly older man, right? But soon enough, things started to shift. As Adam's job began requiring more travel, I found myself spending more time alone. It was during these quiet moments that I started noticing Mr. Thompson's visits becoming more frequent. Sometimes, he'd come by to check on the house. Other times it was just to chat. At first, it felt harmless. After all, he was just being kind. But soon, I began to sense a subtle change in his demeanor. One afternoon, as I tended to my garden, Mr. Thompson stopped by. Our conversations grew longer, his presence more lingering. That day, he asked a question that stuck with me. "Are you happy here?" His eyes held an intensity that made me feel exposed. I hesitated, unsure how to respond. Adam and I loved each other, but the long hours and distance were taking a toll. Still, I pushed those thoughts aside and forced a smile. But Mr. Thompson didn't let it go. "Sometimes," he said softly, "it's easy to forget how important it is to feel heard, to have someone who truly listens." His words sent a shiver down my spine, lingering long after he left. The more he visited, the more I noticed his compliments changing. They became personal, almost intimate. Comments on my appearance, how well I kept the house, things no one else seemed to notice. One evening, while Adam was away on a business trip, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, but there stood Mr. Thompson with his familiar, easy smile. "I was just in the neighborhood," he said. "Thought I'd check in and make sure everything's all right." It had become so routine that I didn't think twice about letting him in. As we talked, the atmosphere grew heavier. He sat closer than usual, his gaze lingering just a little too long. I laughed awkwardly, trying to brush off the unease creeping over me. But then he leaned in slightly, his voice low and soft. "It's rare," he said, "to meet someone like you. Someone who truly listens. Someone who cares." The words were innocent enough, but his tone made my skin crawl. My heart raced, and I shifted uncomfortably, pulling my legs up to create some space between us. He noticed. The air grew thick with an unspoken tension. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," he said softly, his eyes searching mine. "I just wanted you to know you're appreciated. You're a very special person, Sarah." Hearing my name from his lips made my breath catch. The intensity in his gaze left me frozen, unsure how to respond. Before I could speak, he stood up, the easy smile returning to his face. "Well, I should let you get back to your evening," he said. But there was something strange in his voice. Something that left me unsettled long after the door clicked shut. I nodded, my throat tight and dry, watching as he finally stepped out of the house. When the door clicked shut behind him, I released a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. For a long moment, I just sat there, staring at the door, trying to process everything that had just happened. My emotions were a tangled mess. Fear, confusion, and guilt all crashing into one another. I wanted to tell Adam the truth, to explain what had been going on, but something held me back. Shame, maybe, or fear of how he'd react. What if he didn't believe me? What if he got angry? I didn't want to stir up trouble. And yet, I couldn't ignore the way Mr. Thompson's visits made me feel. The unease creeping under my skin every time he was near. There was something off. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Weeks slipped by, and the tension only grew. I hadn't said a word to Adam about the strange interactions with our landlord. Part of me worried he wouldn't understand. Or worse, that he'd blame me somehow. I kept brushing it off, telling myself I was overreacting. But every time Mr. Thompson turned up unannounced, that knot of anxiety tightened just a little more. The way he looked at me lingered in my mind long after he was gone. The way his fingers brushed the armrest of the couch one afternoon. A small, insignificant gesture, but one that felt loaded with something I didn't want to name. I kept replaying those moments in my head, the tension building each time. One quiet Tuesday evening, I stood alone in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. Cooking usually relaxed me, but not tonight. My thoughts were too scattered, my nerves too frayed. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something I wasn't ready for. When the doorbell rang, my heart lurched. I glanced out the kitchen window, and sure enough, there he was. Mr. Thompson stood on the porch with that familiar, easy smile. I hadn't seen him in a few days, and while I should have felt relief, all I felt was dread. Wiping my hands on a towel, I took a steadying breath and walked to the door. "Good evening, Sarah," he greeted warmly as I opened it. "Hope I'm not disturbing you." "No, not at all," I said, forcing a polite smile. I stepped aside, and he entered without hesitation, like he belonged there. His eyes drifted toward the kitchen, his smile widening. "Smells wonderful." "In here," he said. "You're quite the cook." "It's nothing special," I replied, brushing off the compliment. "You always say that," he chuckled, "but you have a way of making even the simplest things extraordinary." I shifted uncomfortably, the words feeling heavier than they should have. There was an intensity in his gaze, something more than just neighborly kindness. "Thank you," I said quickly. "Was there something you needed?" He hesitated, his expression softening. "Actually, I was hoping we could talk. It's been a while since we've had a real conversation." Surprised, I nodded slowly and led him to the living room. He took his usual spot on the couch, and I sat across from him, the space between us feeling far too small. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then his voice dropped, his tone more serious than I'd ever heard. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately," he said. "About life, about how easy it is to get caught up in the day-to-day and forget what really matters." I nodded cautiously. "That's true. It's easy to lose sight of things sometimes." "Exactly," he agreed, his eyes searching mine. "Sometimes we have to take a step back and ask ourselves if we're really living, or just going through the motions." Something about the way he said it made my skin prickle. I wasn't sure where this was going, but I had the sinking feeling I didn't want to find out. "Sarah," he said softly, leaning in just a little. "I don't know how to explain this, but from the moment I met you, I felt a connection, something special, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. The way you carry yourself, you're a remarkable woman. It's hard to put into words just how much I admire you." His words hung in the air, soft yet heavy. I felt my breath catch in my throat. There was a kindness in his tone, but also something deeper, something that felt like a confession. My heart raced, but not in a good way. The room suddenly felt smaller, the walls closer, and I was unsure of how to react. I don't know what to say," I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper. "I appreciate the compliment, Mr. Thompson, but I'm married. I love my husband very much." He didn't seem fazed. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, studying me with an unreadable expression. "I understand," he said quietly, his voice almost apologetic. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable, Sarah, but I also don't want to pretend that I don't feel what I feel." His words hit like a jolt of electricity. He had expressed admiration before, but this was different. This was more intense, more dangerous. A mix of fear and confusion flooded through me. This wasn't just a friendly landlord checking in anymore. This was something else. "I don't want to cause any problems between you and your husband," Mr. Thompson continued, his voice steady but charged. But I couldn't keep pretending. I had to tell you how I felt. I opened my mouth, but no words came. I didn't want to hurt him, but I also couldn't give him any false hope. My mind raced for the right thing to say, something firm but kind, something that would leave no room for doubt. Finally, I took a deep breath, my heart pounding. "Mr. Thompson," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I respect your honesty, but I need to be equally honest with you. I'm committed to my husband, completely. I value our landlord-tenant relationship, but that's where it ends. I hope you can respect that." There was a long pause. I saw disappointment flicker in his eyes, before he looked down at his hands and nodded slowly. "I understand," he said quietly. "I'm sorry if I made you feel uncomfortable. That was never my intention." Relief washed over me, but it was tinged with unease. The tension between us eased, but I knew things would never quite be the same. "Thank you for listening," he said as he stood up. "I respect your boundaries, Sarah. I just needed you to know how I felt." I forced a polite smile, trying to mask the anxiety bubbling inside me. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson. I'll see you around." When he walked out the door, I stood there for a long moment, the empty space where he had been feeling strangely heavy. My thoughts spun in circles. I was married to Adam. We had built a life together. And yet this conversation had happened. Why did it feel like my world was slowly unraveling? I shook my head, pushing the doubt aside. I needed to focus on my life with Adam, to remember the love and commitment we shared. But a small, nagging feeling told me this wasn't over. A few days later, when the doorbell rang, my heart tightened in my chest. I opened the door to find Mr. Thompson standing there again, his expression cautious. "Hello, Sarah," he said, warmly. "I just wanted to check in. Make sure everything's still good with the house." I forced a smile. "Everything's fine. Thanks for asking." He hesitated, then said, "I've been thinking a lot about what I said last time. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. I just didn't want to leave things unsaid." I looked at him for a long moment. This had to end now, firmly, with no room for misunderstanding. "Mr. Thompson, I appreciate your honesty, but I need to be clear. I love my husband. My focus is on my marriage, and I can't allow any distractions. I value our professional relationship, but that's all it will ever be." He nodded slowly, sadness flickering in his eyes. "I understand. I'm sorry if I overstepped." "It's okay. I just wanted to make sure we're on the same page." He gave a respectful nod and turned to leave. As I watched him walk away, a strange mix of emotions stirred inside me. Sadness for the awkwardness that had developed, but also relief for setting the boundaries I needed. That evening, as Adam and I sat down to dinner, I finally felt present. The weight of the past week still lingered, but I knew where my priorities lay. "Everything okay?" Adam asked, his voice gentle as he noticed my quietness. I smiled, taking his hand in mine. "Yeah, it's just good to have you home." He squeezed my hand, his eyes warm. "It's good to be home." In that moment, everything became crystal clear. No matter how complicated or confusing human emotions could be, my commitment to Adam was unwavering. And I knew that as long as we faced things together, we would always find our way back to each other.